Paul Soglin grew up in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Chicago. In the late spring of 1965, he and a dozen other college students were part of the North Shore Summer Project, going door to door with petitions calling for real estate agents to show and sell homes to African Americans. Well, Paul was elected the youngest mayor of Madison, Wisconsin in his history. In 1973, he served as mayor for 3 terms until 1979. Then he went to the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and then worked as a lawyer. Well, he returned to office in 1989. Earlier this year, he took his oath of office for the 8th time, winning re-election with 72% of the vote. Well liked there, well liked here. We appreciate him being here. Paul Soglin.
Thank you very much. And I want to start out with 2 apologies. First, today is my family's annual reunion, and so I've got to get there. I won't be able to stay for the duration. Secondly, I'd like to apologize for my remarks, which may be disjointed, but I've decided after hearing Mr. Black's remarks that I want to change everything and basically reflect on what he had said. When he and my parents returned from World War II, they were determined to ensure that the justice and the fairness that they fought for around the world was to come back to the United States. That if there was not to be racism and genocide in Europe, it was not to be in Chicago. If there were injustices in Asia, there were not to be such injustices in this great country. And so those of us who were raised in the shadow of World War II actually believed that there could be fair, peaceful, and equitable nations. And believing that, we set out in the 1950s and the 1960s to do our part, understanding it was a monumental task, but not understanding how much we could accomplish and yet how much more we would have to do in the coming years and still have to do 50 and 60 and 70 years later. Just this past week in my own city, a blind man with his dog was denied passage by an unlicensed cab driver. It's not unusual. Something similar happened in San Francisco last year, where actually the individual was told that he'd have to put the dog in the trunk of the car. Okay. While we see great strides made in terms of fairness for marriage for all people, the injustices continue, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about national origin, or we're talking about the tens of millions of people in this country who have the challenge of not being able to go to college because perhaps they arrived in this country when they were 6 months old. The children of caring parents who wanted a better and a fairer life. A lot is said today about regulation, but I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that it is regulation that got us where we are today, and in so many ways brought fairness and justice to the people of this country. When the first electric utilities refused to go into Appalachia and the hills of Arkansas, it was regulation that brought electricity to the most impoverished families. When the telephone companies wired the wealthiest communities, and there was once a day we were dependent upon telephones with wires, it was regulation that ensured that Lawndale had telephone service. And when we look at the transformation that took place in the 60s in regards to voting, in regards to housing. It was regulation, just and fair and needed regulation, that is still required today. Unfortunately, in some states and in some communities, there are others who do not have open and loving hearts, who are using regulation to thwart some of those successes. They are now turning back the clock way past the poll tax in terms of voter identification, in terms of other impediments, so that all people might not be able to get to the ballot box. It's that heritage and it's that legacy that sets us out on another march of 50 years. A march that's going to have its setbacks, its difficulties and challenges, but is going to lead to the goal we all embrace, which is that fairness and equity for all people. I didn't say all Americans, I said all people, and we should honor that. My participation in the North Shore Summer Project was made possible by many leaders in this area. 50 years ago, we made a distinction between the students and the grown-ups. Sitting under the shade of this tent over here are those people who participated in the North Shore Summer Project. I can't tell anymore the difference between which ones are the grown-ups and which ones are the students. But let's give all of them a round of applause for the work that they did. I'd also like to recognize that unfortunately many of them have passed away. And I would be remiss if I didn't put out a big thank you to the young woman that you saw, one of the young women you saw in the video a moment ago, who was my partner in the project, Joanne Ugolini, who had so much heart in confronting racism and bigot on the very blocks where we live.